Snow had been falling since midnight, the kind that swallows wagon tracks and smothers the sound of a woman's sobs. Yet Mary's cries seemed to echo in the frozen air as she sat hunched in the wagon seat, fingers clamped white around the edge of an empty cradle. Her breath came in ragged clouds, every exhale pulling at the raw ache in her chest, for the child she had nursed through fever and storm was gone, taken in the dead hours before dawn. She remembered the creak of the latch, the faint jingle of tack, and then the shadow of a man vanishing into the pale light of snow with her baby in his arms. No trail remained, only the silent white drift, and she had been left in the hollow of the mountains with a cold wind tearing at her bonnet. She didn't notice the figure at first, not until the shape resolved from the tree line. A tall, broad man with a coat of battered hide and a beard rimed with frost. The world seemed to hold its breath as he drew closer, each step breaking the crust of snow with a crunch, his gaze locked on hers. In his left hand, clutched like something sacred, was the blue flannel blanket she'd wrapped around her child hours ago. Her throat caught, terror and hope warring in her eyes, because if he had the blanket, he'd either found her baby or the place where her baby had been. He stopped a few paces away, the wind pushing between them like a living thing, and his voice came low and steady, telling her he had followed a set of tracks through the timber, smaller than a man's boot and leading toward the North Pass. The blanket, he said, had been dropped in haste. His name was Calder Boone, and though the name was little more than a rumor in her mind, whispered tales of a mountain man who kept to himself, it now stood before her like the last living chance she had. He slid the blanket toward her, and as her numb fingers brushed it, she caught a strange weight sewn into one corner. Inside, hidden beneath layers of cloth, was a strip of leather marked with a brand she recognized from her late husband's ranch. Her heart lurched. This was no random theft. Someone had come for her child because of the blood in his veins. And now, with the snow deepening and the light already thinning, Calder Boone's eyes told her plainly, if they didn't ride now, she might never see her son again. The cold bit sharper as Calder swung himself into the saddle, his horse's breath curling into the air like smoke from a dying fire. He didn't waste time with comfort or promises, only jerked his chin toward the gelding tethered behind the wagon, a silent command for Mary to mount. Her hands shook as she gathered the reins, the baby's blanket pressed under her coat, the hidden leather strip a weight heavier than any storm. Calder's eyes swept the tree line before he nudged his horse forward, breaking a trail toward the North Pass, where jagged cliffs rose like walls of iron. The snow was deeper here, clinging to the pines in thick, drooping sleeves, and though the wind scoured their faces, Calder kept his gaze fixed low, following faint indentations half swallowed by drifts. Mary's mind swirled with the brand burned into that leather strip, a mark belonging to the Harlan Ranch, bitter enemies of her husband's family since a border feud left 2 men dead. She realized with a jolt that whoever had taken her son was carrying old hatred forward in a new way. Calder slowed suddenly, raising a hand. Ahead, the trail split. One set of tracks angled toward the high pass, the other dipped into a narrow ravine where dark pines clustered close. He dismounted, crouching to study the prints, his broad back hunched against the wind. Mary's heart pounded as she scanned the wilderness, the oppressive silence broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the muffled crunch of Calder's boots in the snow. When he rose, his face was grim. The smaller trail, he said, belonged to a woman, boots lighter, stride shorter, likely hired to carry the child while the others doubled back to lay false tracks. It was a tactic meant to send any pursuers into the mountains to freeze. Calder's voice dropped, telling her he'd seen this trick before. And the last time, the child hadn't lived to see spring. Mary's stomach twisted, but before she could speak, he pointed to a scrap of fabric snagged on a pine branch down the ravine, a shred of blue flannel, frayed and damp. Her breath caught. The cold seemed to vanish beneath the hot surge of desperation. Calder swung into the saddle again, eyes narrowing as he glanced at the sky. Snow would close the ravine by nightfall. If they wanted to catch the woman before she vanished into the timber, they had hours at most. Without waiting for her answer, he spurred his horse forward, the sound of hoofbeats swallowed almost instantly by the storm that chased them into the trees. The ravine narrowed until the walls of pine seemed to lean in, their branches heavy with snow that fell in sudden dumps when the wind surged. Calder rode ahead, every sense tuned to the faint impressions in the drifts, his horse careful on the uneven ground. Mary followed, the cold gnawing at her fingers even through her gloves, her thoughts circling the same terrible truth. If the Harlans had her child, there was no telling how far they'd go to settle old scores. A flicker of movement ahead made Calder's hand shoot up. He slid from the saddle in one fluid motion, rifle in hand, and jerked his head for her to stay put. She watched him move forward, every step silent, his frame blending into the white and brown of the wilderness. The trees swallowed him for a heartbeat, then two, until a muffled cry broke the air. Not a baby's, but a woman's sharp gasp. Mary's heart slammed against her ribs. She urged her horse forward just enough to see. Calder had a woman pinned against a tree, her hood fallen back to reveal wind-chapped cheeks and eyes wide with fear. In her arms, wrapped in the familiar blue blanket, was Mary's baby, his tiny fists flailing against the cold. Relief crashed through Mary so hard she nearly slid from the saddle, but it was short-lived, because the woman wasn't alone. A shadow moved in the branches above, and before Mary could shout, a figure dropped from a low pine limb, knocking Calder sideways into the snow. The rifle skidded out of reach. The new attacker was tall, wiry, with a scarf pulled up over his mouth and a pistol gleaming in his hand. He barked something to the woman, who clutched the baby tighter and began backing away. Calder rolled, snow spraying, and drove his fist into the man's knee, sending him stumbling. Mary's instincts took over. She slid from the saddle, snatched the rifle, and swung it toward the retreating woman. Her hands shook, breath steaming in the cold, but the woman froze at the sight of the barrel. Calder wrestled the pistol free from his opponent, then snapped at Mary to hold her ground. With the man groaning in the snow and the woman trapped, Calder stepped forward, his eyes like chips of ice. He told the woman he knew whose brand was sewn into that blanket, and that she'd better start talking before the rest of the Harlan gang showed up to finish what they started. The woman's lips trembled as she glanced between Calder's unyielding stare and the baby squirming in her arms, the snowflakes catching in her hair like flecks of frost. She finally blurted that her name was Liza, and she'd been paid in silver to carry the child through the ravine to a rendezvous on the far side of the ridge. Calder pressed for more, but her eyes flicked upward, and Mary followed her gaze to the high slope beyond the pines. Dark silhouettes moved against the pale sky. 3 riders, spaced wide, their horses picking carefully along the ridge. Calder cursed under his breath. The Harlan gang had arrived early, and from their position they could cut off every exit from the ravine. Without breaking eye contact with Liza, Calder told Mary to take the baby. She stepped forward, her arms aching with the sudden weight of him, his warmth seeping through the blanket like the only real heat left in the world. Calder gripped Liza's arm and shoved her toward the horses. "She rides with us now," he said flatly, "until I know how deep she's in this." Above them, one of the ridge riders turned his horse sharply down slope, snow spraying as the gang began to descend. Calder wasted no time. He swung into the saddle and spurred his mount into the trees, Mary clinging to her own horse behind him with the baby pressed close. The forest swallowed them, but the sound of pursuit echoed. Hoofbeats hammering the frozen ground, branches snapping as the Harlans drove hard to close the gap. The trail dipped into a narrow chute between rock walls, the kind where a single fall could mean a broken leg or worse. Calder pulled them through, his voice low and calm despite the danger, telling Mary that if they could reach the ice flats beyond the timber, they might lose their trackers in the open glare. But the chute ended too soon, spilling them onto a slope of open snow where speed was their only shield. Mary dared a glance over her shoulder. The riders were closer now, their faces grim beneath pulled-down hats, rifles bouncing in their scabbards. One raised his arm, and a shot cracked, the bullet biting into a pine trunk beside her with a spray of splinters. The baby whimpered, and Calder's voice cut through the chaos, sharp, commanding, telling her to keep her head down. The gang wasn't just chasing anymore. They were herding. And if Calder was right, they weren't riding to kill her. They were riding to take the child back. The snowfield stretched wide before them, its glare blinding in the weak sun. But Calder didn't slow. His horse tore across the flats, hooves pounding the crust, each breath a plume in the freezing air. Mary clutched the baby tighter, her muscles screaming with the effort to keep her balance as the wind sliced through her coat. Behind them, the Harlans fanned out, their dark shapes stark against the white, moving like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Calder veered toward a jagged outcrop of rock jutting from the snow, the only cover for half a mile. They reached it seconds before the gang did, Calder yanking his horse behind the stone and swinging from the saddle in one fluid motion. "Down!" he barked, pulling Mary with him and shielding her and the child with his broad frame. The first rider came hard, rifle up, but Calder's own shot cracked first, shattering the man's hat from his head and sending his horse skittering sideways. The others reined in, rifles glinting in the pale light. Mary's heart pounded as she recognized the man at their center, a broad-shouldered rider with a scar down his jaw, the mark of a fight long past. That was Jed Harlan, the one her husband had sworn was responsible for his brother's death. Jed's gaze locked on her, then slid to the bundle in her arms, his expression curling into something between triumph and contempt. "You're holding what ain't yours," he called, voice carrying easily over the snow. Calder's stance didn't shift. "That child's not a piece of cattle to brand," he shot back, his voice like steel. Jed chuckled, but it was humorless. He told her loud enough for the mountains to hear that the boy carried the Harlan bloodline through her husband's mother, and that meant he belonged on Harlan land, whether she liked it or not. Mary's stomach turned cold. Calder leaned close, his words low and fierce in her ear, telling her not to believe a word. This was about revenge, not blood. Jed signaled, and two riders began to circle wide, their path aiming to cut off the escape route back to the timber. Calder's eyes narrowed. He had seconds to choose between holding ground and risking a firefight, or making a break that could leave their backs exposed. Snow whispered under the Harlans' horses as they drew closer, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon light. Then Calder's hand closed around Mary's arm, his voice calm but urgent. "When I move, ride hard. Don't look back." He didn't wait for her answer. He stepped out from behind the rock and fired, the shot echoing like thunder across the flats. The rifle crack still rang in Mary's ears when Calder grabbed her bridle and slapped the horse's flank, sending it lunging forward. She clung to the baby, the world tilting as the gelding bounded through the snow, each hoofbeat pounding like her own racing pulse. Calder's horse thundered beside her, his rifle flashing as he fired over her shoulder, keeping the Harlans' heads down. Jed's curse carried across the flats, followed by the sharp whistle he used to signal his men. Two riders broke off, angling to intercept, their horses churning through the drifts like predators cutting across a herd. Calder didn't slow. He leaned low in the saddle, shouting for her to keep the timber in sight. The wind screamed in her ears, freezing the tears on her cheeks, but she didn't dare look back. A shot rang out from her right, close enough to hiss past her hood. The baby startled with a cry, his tiny fists pressing into her chest. Calder surged ahead, swerving sharply toward a frozen creek that split the flats. Without warning, he plunged his horse down the embankment and onto the ice, hooves skittering for purchase before finding rhythm. Mary followed, heart lurching as her horse's weight made the surface groan beneath them. The sound of pursuit faltered. The Harlans hesitated at the edge, wary of the slick trap. Calder used the moment, cutting along the winding creek, the ice carrying them faster than snow ever could. But the reprieve was brief. Jed himself spurred down onto the ice, his stallion steady under him, eyes fixed like a hawk's. One of his men followed, and Mary realized they were willing to risk the crossing to get the boy back. Calder glanced over, reading her fear, and called out to steer for a break in the far bank where a line of willows marked a rise. They hit the snow again with a jolt, the horses lunging up the slope, and Calder wheeled to cover her retreat. He fired twice, forcing Jed to veer wide, but the man's eyes burned with promise. This wasn't over. By the time they reached the cover of the pines, Mary's arms ached from holding the baby, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Calder pulled alongside, his face set against the cold. "They won't quit," he said. "Not until one of us is in the ground." Behind them, through the curtain of falling snow, she could still see the faint shapes moving on the flats, steady and relentless. The chase had bought them miles, but not safety. They made camp deep in the pines where the snow lay thinner beneath the thick canopy, the shadows stretching long in the dying light. Calder set a small fire, its smoke barely curling above the branches before vanishing into the wind. Mary huddled close with the baby, the blue blanket wrapped tight, her eyes darting to Liza, who sat apart with her knees drawn up, face half hidden in her hood. Calder's gaze never left the tree line, but his voice was low when he told Mary to rest in shifts. Someone had to keep watch, and the Harlans were likely closer than the silence suggested. The fire's warmth lulled her for a moment, but a faint rustle snapped her awake. Calder was on his feet before she could speak, rifle in hand, moving toward the sound. That's when she saw Liza move, quick and purposeful, slipping a small blade from her boot and glancing toward the edge of the firelight where the horses were tethered. Mary's pulse roared in her ears. She shifted the baby into one arm and grabbed for the nearest stick, her voice sharp as she called Liza's name. The woman froze, eyes wide, then bolted toward the horses. Calder lunged, but Liza had already sliced one lead rope free, sending a horse skittering into the darkness. She wheeled on him, the knife flashing, and spat that she'd warned the Harlans of their route before leaving town. Her voice cracked with something like desperation, as she swore she'd only done it because they promised her more silver than she'd see in a lifetime. Calder wrenched the blade from her grip and shoved her back towards the fire, his expression colder than the snow underfoot. He told her she'd just signed her own death warrant, because if the Harlans didn't find her first, he'd make sure she never let another child into their hands. Mary's stomach churned as Liza's eyes flicked past Calder into the trees. At first she thought it was fear, then she heard it, the faint crunch of snow, steady and deliberate. Calder's head snapped toward the sound, and the firelight caught the glint of steel between the trunks. Jed Harlan's voice drifted in, slow and certain, telling them the chase was over. Liza's breath hitched, but whether from relief or terror, Mary couldn't tell. Calder stepped in front of her and the baby, his rifle steady. The flames danced shadows over the snow as the gang's shapes emerged from the dark. This time there'd be no running before bullets flew. Jed Harlan stepped into the firelight like he owned it, snowflakes melting into the creases of his scarred face. His men fanned out behind him, rifles resting easy but ready, their boots crunching in unison on the frozen ground. Calder stood square, his frame blocking Mary and the baby, the rifle steady in his hands. "Hand over the boy," Jed said, his voice low and smooth, "and we'll leave you breathing. You've got my word." Calder's laugh was short and sharp, the sound of a man who'd heard too many lies. "Your word's worth less than the dirt under my boots," he replied. Jed's eyes narrowed. He shifted his gaze to Liza, who stood trembling at the edge of the firelight. "You did your part," he said, "but I'll be taking him now." Liza's mouth opened like she wanted to speak, but Jed cut her off with a flick of his hand. Calder's thumb brushed the rifle's hammer. The cold air seemed to thicken, every breath hanging between them like smoke. One of Jed's men stepped forward, the firelight glinting off his revolver. Calder moved first. His rifle cracked, the shot punching into the snow an inch from the man's boot, sending him stumbling back. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire split the night, muzzle flashes sparking against the pines. Mary dropped behind a fallen log, curling her body around the baby, his startled cries drowned in the roar of shots. Calder moved like a shadow, reloading between fir trunks, each shot measured, each step calculated. The Harlans returned fire, their bullets shredding bark, snow spraying in sharp bursts. Jed barked orders, trying to push his men forward, but Calder's aim kept them pinned at the tree line. Liza ducked low, her eyes wild, and crawled toward Mary as if to shield herself from both sides. Mary's grip tightened on the baby, every instinct screaming not to trust her. Then a shot rang so close it made her ears ring. Calder had dropped one of Jed's men where he stood, the man's rifle clattering to the snow. Jed's roar was pure fury. The standoff was crumbling into bloodshed, and both sides knew it couldn't last. Calder's voice cut through the din. He yelled for Mary to run toward the creek bed to the north while he held the line. She hesitated, but the baby whimpered against her chest, and another bullet hissed past her ear. With no choice, she gathered herself and bolted into the shadows, the snow deep and dragging at her legs. Behind her, Calder's rifle spoke again, defiant and unyielding, holding death at bay for one more night. The forest swallowed her whole, the firelight fading behind like the last memory of safety. Snow stung Mary's cheeks as branches clawed at her coat, each step through the drifts a battle against exhaustion. The baby's weight was both anchor and purpose, his faint whimpering muffled in the folds of the blanket. Behind her, the gunfire thinned to single shots, then silence, and for one breathless moment she feared what that meant for Calder. A twig snapped somewhere to her left. She froze, heart pounding, listening. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, and closing. Mary tightened her hold on the child and pushed forward, angling toward the creek bed Calder had mentioned. The moonlight spilled faint silver over the snow, enough to guide her down the slope. She slid into the frozen channel, its surface cracked and glittering, and began to follow it north. The ice groaned under her boots, echoing like whispers in the dark. Then came a sound that nearly buckled her knees, a low whistle, sharp and quick, the same signal she'd heard Jed use. Her breath caught. Shadows moved on the bank above, two figures pacing her from the trees. She pressed herself against the far edge of the creek, hoping the black outline of the pines would hide her. But the riders knew the terrain. They dropped down onto the ice ahead, cutting her off. Panic flared white-hot. But before she could turn back, a third shape emerged from the dark behind her. The moonlight caught the glint of a rifle barrel, and then the face above it. Calder. Relief slammed into her so hard her knees gave way. He strode forward, rifle raised, his eyes hard as flint. "Get behind me," he ordered, voice hoarse. The riders hesitated, their mounts shifting uneasily on the slick surface. Calder took another step, his tone cold enough to freeze the air between them. "You've got one chance to ride out of here." One man spat into the snow, muttering that Jed would skin them alive if they came back empty-handed. Calder's rifle didn't waver. "Better him than me," he said. After a long moment, the men turned their horses, disappearing into the pines without another word. Mary didn't wait to speak. She just followed as Calder led her off the creek and into a narrow gully where the snow lay deep but quiet. They pushed through for what felt like hours until the first gray hint of dawn touched the horizon. Only then did Calder stop, listening hard to the silence. "We're not safe yet," he said, his breath clouding in the cold air. "But we've bought enough time to make a stand." The dawn light spilled pale gold over Willow Bend, where the frozen creek curved wide beneath a stand of ancient cottonwoods. Calder stopped there, his breath steady despite the cold, and scanned the open ground. "This is where we end it," he said, and there was no doubt in his voice. Mary's arms ached from holding the baby through the long night, but she knew this was the last stretch between fear and freedom. Calder moved quickly, breaking dead branches and scattering them across the snow in patterns only he seemed to understand. He told her to take cover behind a fallen cottonwood, keep the baby's cries muffled, and not move until he said. Minutes later, the sound came. Hoofbeats, steady and sure. Jed Harlan rode at the head of 4 men, their shadows long in the low morning sun. He reined in at the bend, eyes narrowing when he saw Calder standing alone in the open. "You could have kept running," Jed called, "but you chose to die here." Calder's mouth curved, not in a smile, but something colder. "No," he said, "I chose to finish it here." Jed's gaze flicked to the creek, then to the cottonwoods, reading the land. But he didn't see the snare lines hidden under the drift or the way the ice on the bend had been weakened in the night. Calder fired the first shot, not at Jed, but at the ice under the lead rider's horse. The surface shattered with a crack like thunder, sending the animal plunging into the freezing water. Panic rippled through the gang. 2 more riders tried to turn, only to have their mounts tangled in the deadfall Calder had laid across their retreat. Jed charged forward, pistol drawn, fury twisting his scarred face. Calder dropped to one knee, his shot knocking the weapon from Jed's hand. The man lunged anyway, crashing into Calder with enough force to send them both into the snow. They grappled, breath steaming in the cold air, until Calder drove his fist into Jed's jaw, then shoved him toward the weakened edge of the creek. The ice gave way, and Jed went in hard, the current dragging him under. Silence fell but for the rush of water beneath the ice. Calder stood there for a long moment, chest heaving, before turning back to Mary. She rose from her cover, the baby still clutched close, and for the first time in days, her knees didn't feel like they might give. Calder reached for the boy, cradling him with surprising gentleness. "It's over," he said quietly. Mary looked at the cottonwoods, their branches swaying in the winter light, and knew he was right. For now, at least, the West had given them back their breath.